Hey, and welcome back, Gurus. I'm Chase, your Azure Training Architect at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company. Welcome to part 2, the Network Security Groups lesson, where we're going to be picking back up on learning about NSGs, starting off with talking about how NSG security rules affect filtering inbound and outbound traffic for virtual networks. We'll then get into talking about how those security rules might impact intra-network traffic. Then we're going to talk about the extensibility provided with additional features to give our security rules on our NSGs intelligence, and we'll wrap up this part 2 with the key takeaways from both part 1 and part 2 of Network Security Group's lesson. All right, Gurus, without further ado, let's get started by talking about how NSG security rules affect filtering inbound and outbound traffic. Let's start off with a diagram here. Let's say we have an on-premise network and we have a virtual network, and inside of this virtual network in Azure, we have two subnets, a web server subnet and a database subnet, each with a virtual machine workload that is providing the web serving functionality and the database for our web application. And each of these subnets has a network security group at the subnet boundary. Now, when it comes to filtering traffic, let's start off by talking about inbound traffic. With inbound traffic, let's say we want to allow HTTP from the internet so that people can reach our web application, and we specify this with a priority of 1100. But let's say we want to tighten up security for administration and deny traffic inbound for SSH from the internet. Now, at some point, we're going to want to administer this, and as we see, if this rule exists, we won't be able to administer from anywhere because we're specifying a wildcard of any as denoted by the asterisk. If we wanted to allow this traffic, we could specify a rule with a lower priority, such as 1150, and allow SSH inbound from a particular IP address, and that could be the public IP that is represented by our network, and this will allow us to administer our virtual machine over SSH and deny SSH from anywhere, similar to what we saw in the previous example. Now that we've covered inbound traffic, let's talk about our outbound traffic here. Let's say we want to allow SQL traffic from our database VM to the private IP address of our web server VM. Now we could allow that via a specified rule that is user defined, but we also have to keep in mind there are our default security rules, such as the allow internet outbound rule that's going to allow internet outbound from this database as well. And that's something that we need to think about when we're establishing network security rules inside of our NSGs. Now that we understand inbound and outbound traffic, let's talk about intra-network traffic here. To understand intra-network traffic, let's first talk about some of the default rules we have, right? We have a default allow internet inbound rule and a default rule for allowing internet outbound. Then we have the default rule of allowing traffic within the private known IP space, be that our virtual network or peered networks. And this allows our VMs to communicate. But if we were to create a rule that impacts this communication between resources, such as the rules to deny all inbound and outbound from anywhere, well, then that impacts the ability for these virtual machines, even though they exist inside of the same virtual network, to communicate. That's something to think about when we're creating security rules. Now that we understand how intra-network traffic might be impacted and deny communications between these resources, as we see here in this diagram, let's move into talking about extensibility for our NSGs and additional features that exist. With our NSGs, it's important to understand that we have the ability to refer to a collection of IP addresses using something known as service tags on our security rules. For example, we have internet as a service tag to represent the 0.0.0.0/0 IP address space, representing all IPs. And we have service tags for multiple different things, as we'll see when we get into actually working with our NSGs. As far as additional features, we also have, as we learn, the ability to logically group resources with application security groups so that we can make sure to provide the application structure awareness to our NSGs to make it easier to administer the NSGs and their security rules. And we'll learn more about ASGs in a future lesson. Now, another thing that we will learn more about later in another lesson, but we want to at least mention now as an additional feature, is that we have the ability to monitor the flows of traffic through our NSGs using something known as NSG flow logs. And these allow us to perform diagnostics on those flows of traffic to evaluate the effectiveness of our rules. And what we have here is our traffic flowing through our NSG, and it's being archived into a storage account so that we can perform diagnostics on these flows of traffic to better understand the effectiveness of our security rules. Now that we've covered that, let's wrap up this lesson with the key takeaways for network security groups. So the really important things I want you to take away about network security groups from part 1 and part 2 of this lesson are that network security groups are used to secure traffic inbound and outbound for resources that exist inside of a single virtual network. And these NSGs are associated at the subnet boundary, which means that they then apply to all network interfaces of every resource inside that subnet, or we can apply them specifically at a single network interface, just impacting specifically the resource associated with that network interface. Then we also have to remember with our NSGs, we can have multiple associations going on at the same time. We can associate the same NSG with multiple subnets and also multiple network interfaces, all at the same time, making it easier for us to administer our NSG security rules and control network flow of our traffic. And another thing to consider when talking about associating our NSGs with resources is that we have to understand that NSGs are scoped to resources that are deployed inside of the same Azure region. As we saw, if we move those resources to another region, well, that network security group doesn't support moving, so we would have to create new NSGs inside of that region where the resources now exist. And the other key takeaways that we want to understand for NSGs are that we can use application security groups, which we're going to dive deeper in on the next lesson inside of this section, is that they extend the functionality of NSGs, and we'll cover that in the application security groups lesson. Then we have to understand that we use service tags to refer to a group of IP addresses defined by Azure, such as Internet or API management, and we'll see more about this in the following lesson, where we are actually administering network security groups. And then finally, we have to understand that we have extensibility, where we can create flow logs for our NSGs and evaluate the associated NSGs and evaluate the effectiveness of the security rules through additional features provided for our NSGs. All right, gurus, that is everything for now. Thanks so much for joining me in part 1 and part 2 of this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.